All right, sunsets are a great subject for photography. They tend to trigger our imaginations and capture a very romanticized part of the day where light is just at its most beautiful with bright glowing orange overtones, and it really creates a flattering light source for portraits. If you want to try backlighting your subjects and putting the sunset behind your subject, or even looking behind you. As a photographer, oftentimes we forget to look all the way around in 360 degrees, and we get so caught up on what's going on with the sun and the clouds that we forget to look behind us at the objects that are bathed in this beautiful glowing light. So today in this PowerPoint, we're going to look at capturing that beautiful sunset glow and how to do it well in a DSLR camera as well as on your cell phone. So obviously DSLR cameras are more capable than cell phones to capture a creative sunset and to capture the true colors as you would see them in your eye. But there are tips and techniques for kind of tricking your phone camera to do a good job with this subject as well. So Mark W. Decker is a photographer that really strives to capture the sunset at its most beautiful by using various artistic approaches. So you can see here different compositional methods that he has used to create these postcard beautiful sunrises and sunsets. So he might be a photographer to look into. So the first step when taking a sunrise photograph is to plan ahead. So think about what types of scenes would really lend themselves well to highlighting this beautiful time of day. Think about what types of subjects would make good foreground elements, such as objects that you can see through, like whether it's architecture that has like a roof but maybe no walls, or if it's a tree with lots of branches that the light can filter through, so that we can really see our sunset as the main subject, and the foreground elements are just meant to highlight this or to add some uniqueness to your scene. So these can be objects that, again, the sun can go through, or that have a very distinct outline that are really recognizable objects as opposed to just being big blobs of blackness. So think about arriving early in the day, planning out your shoot. Where do you think the sunset's going to be at its best? Pay attention to the weather and look at what's going on in the sky. Are there clouds? A cloudy, slightly cloudy day is the best, or partly cloudy, or even like a rainy day would have the best atmospheric effects for these sunset pictures. So again, find a location with silhouettes, objects in the foreground that can really help create a special, unique picture of this great time of day. Holden is another local wildlife nature photographer that specializes in sunsets at Route 66 Park. So this is basically his favorite point of view, and he has captured sunsets. It could be, I think he has like something like one sunset for every day of the year, just over time, over the years that he's captured them. And he's always chasing that better sunset. So on this, you can see he's using reflections in the water to really make the sunset look its best and to create repetition with that beautiful sky. So finding elements of reflective quality, whether it's the reflectiveness of a car, reflecting the sunset up above, or water or glass somehow, creating that reflection to really make the sunset look its best and create that framing element as well. So just some different techniques to touch on whenever you're thinking about capturing sunsets. You want to underexpose your picture on purpose. So that means if you're using a DSLR camera with different semi-auto modes, you'll want to be shooting in aperture priority mode and use the exposure compensation in order to underexpose your photograph at least 2 or 3 stops, because you really want your foreground elements to be in silhouette, to be in shadow, and you want your sky to look really beautiful, which means you have to underexpose to properly expose for the sky. So while the light is changing, it changes very rapidly within that last 30 minutes before the sun disappears behind the horizon. It's changing so rapidly that that's why you want to shoot on aperture priority mode, so that you're not constantly having to change your settings as the sun goes down further and further. You can just let the camera do that on its own, and you're constantly capturing at that that underexposed setting. Now, once the sun disappears below the horizon, you'll want to switch to manual mode so that you have the most creative control over the way you actually want the sunset to appear. So usually you want to continue to underexpose, but the light won't change quite as rapidly, so you can take pictures on manual mode. Now you might want to even switch to f/22 in order to capture like the solar flare effect, where it's really going to focus in on the sun. You'll have that great depth of field, so you see those sun rays totally in focus along with the foreground elements, and it may mean that you have to increase your ISO a little bit, but for the most part you want it to be underexposed anyway, so f/22 should be a good way to do that. And you'll want to shoot in RAW mode. So JPEG doesn't have quite as many details as RAW, so you can really lift out the details from the blown highlights or from the lost shadows in order to create an HDR type effect. So HDR stands for high dynamic range. This means that you have details in every level of your photograph. You have details in the shadows, you have details in the highlights, and you have details in the midground. And one way that you can fake this effect if you don't have an HDR setting on your camera is you can take 3 separate photos. You can take one photo that you meter on the highlights, so the sunset will be really bright and bold and vivid and really well focused or well exposed, and then the foreground will be in shadow. Or you can meter on the shadows. The shadows will have a lot of detail. You'll see lights and darks and a range of values within those shadow details in the foreground, but your sunset's going to be overexposed. And then you can take a picture that's somewhere in the middle. And then what you do in Photoshop is you blend those 3 pictures together using the HDR automated mode under File, Automate, and you can put those 3 pictures together and Photoshop will smartly blend them and allow exposure in all 3 zones. So that's if you don't want silhouettes in the foreground. That's if you want a picture like this where the sky is well exposed, the water is well exposed, everything looks like it's a good exposure. And that's impossible to do in the camera all at once unless you have an HDR setting where it's kind of taking those 3 pictures automatically. Because the camera is just not as good as our eye. So what you see in your eye in the scene is not going to be what the camera captures unless you really know how to harness those settings and, you know, the manual setting. But even then, oftentimes you have to take multiple photos at different settings and blend them together to get something that even comes close to what our eyes can see. Our eyes are much better machines and much better at seeing than the camera is. The camera still is far from, you know, matching the design of our biology. So in terms of white balance with these sunsets, you don't want to leave your camera on auto because it doesn't do a really great job of, again, mimicking what your eyes see. So the white balance setting that probably does the best job with this orangey glow is shade, because it's later in the day, so it is in kind of like a sense of shade, and it's really going to expose the shadows and the highlights with more of like that orangey glow that you're used to seeing. Use the rule of thirds when photographing a sunset. So in this case, the landscape was just so beautiful with the waterfalls and the reflection and everything that this photographer chose to fill the frame with 2/3 of the landscape and only 1/3 with the sunset. But traditionally, if the sunset is really quite pretty, then you want to fill your scene mostly with the sunset and then have the landscape at the bottom third, taking up less of the photograph than the sky, because the sky is really what's beautiful. It has clouds, it has glowing, warm colors with like a sequence of colors from, you know, cool through warm, like reds and pinks and blues and gold, whatever you can find, whatever that particular sunset looks like that day, you probably want to fill your frame with it. Also, think about what your foreground is going to be, and then you want to focus about 1/3 of the way through the scene, 1/3 of the way up in your landscape. So in this case, they probably focused on the sky, on the water, and then the sky just has a great depth of field. So you don't want to focus on those clouds because we tend to enjoy those colors, even if the clouds are a little bit out of focus. But if the foreground's out of focus, then it's going to be kind of distracting. So we're used to seeing things that are closer to us being in focus. Unless you're trying to do something very special with framing, traditionally you want to focus 1/3 of the way up in your scene and then recompose and click your shot. Okay, also if you stay a little bit longer after the sunset is over, this is something that a lot of photographers forget about. They take their pictures, the sun goes down and they leave. But if you wait about 25 or 30 minutes after the sunset, you get kind of a second sunset when the sky is illuminated again. So you don't want to lose that photo opportunity as well. So you can take pictures at the beginning of the day. Sunrise kind of mimics the sunset in color and intensity. So neither one of those is better than the other. It's just a matter of whether you can get up early enough, or if you're more of a night owl, you might want to capture the one at the end of the day. And then here just our last little, techniques continued. Something that you can think about using is a panorama, which is where you go, laterally across a scene to capture a longer than just, your traditional sized photograph. So maybe the whole sky is bathed in this beautiful light and you want to capture just that long sense of, close to the horizon line, or what's called a vertorama, something I just learned about, which is taking a panorama vertically. So you can go up and down depending on how interesting the foreground is, along with how high the sunset goes into the sky. That can be a very unique cropping for your photograph. Also, like I said, use f/22 so you have great depth of field. This example here on the left has the shallow depth of field, so that's also an option. If you focus a third of the way up, you can make your clouds, everything out of focus on purpose. Think about using a telephoto lens if you want to zoom in on the sun and make it look really big in the sky, or use a wide angle lens if you want to exaggerate the size of the landscape and you want your sun to be very small. So you probably don't want to look right at the sun through a telephoto lens because it can intensify the rays, but you can use something like that live view mode to make it easier to look at and frame. Use a tripod. If you're shooting at f/22, you're probably going to be using a very, very long shutter speed. In the picture on the previous slide, you noticed probably that the water was all fuzzy and out of focus. This was because the photographer used a very long shutter speed in order to capture the colors and the lights, at this later time of day with f/22, it can be very difficult to allow light in for enough time. So you have to use a tripod to really steady that camera. You can use what's called a neutral density or graduated neutral density filter, which looks like, it's just like a UV filter on the end of your lens, but it fades from darker at the top to transparent at the bottom. So it's going to block out the light at the top to prevent your sunset from being overexposed on your camera. So this is one way you can kind of trick the meter on it regularly and then put the filter on so that it will expose each zone properly. The sky will be slightly underexposed, the foreground will be slightly overexposed, and it's kind of simulating the HDR effect where you have highlights in every area, or you have a balanced exposure in your highlights and in your shadows. So that's if you're getting really technical, but those are kind of an investment. You can also simulate this effect in Photoshop by adding that gradient on your mask to darken just one half or the other. Make sure your horizon line is even. There's nothing more distracting in a sunset photo than when the horizon line is crooked. So take pains to make that balanced and make that exact. And you can even go back in Photoshop and double check to make sure that that was level. There's different free sunset apps that you can use on your phone to make it easier to photograph sunsets, also to know when the sunset's going to be. So you won't miss a sunset. Every day of the year, it'll tell you when to expect the sun to go down, so you can make plans around that. And then when you're trying to photograph a portrait, sunsets are great backdrops for portraits because as you can see here in this example, it really allows an even lighting on the face of your model, and the background may be overexposed if you meter on your model. So instead of making them in silhouette, you focus on them and make your camera settings adjust for their face. So it's okay if the background's a little bit overexposed. They have this nice rim lighting going on around them that helps create that separation from the background. Using a telephoto lens can increase this effect even more, so you can get that shallow depth of field. You're showing the background is really not that important. It's not as important as the glowing light that's surrounding your figure and really helping to create this dreamy, romantic-like portrait at the end of the day when light is at its most beautiful. You can also try posing them so they're looking at the sun. And then you can photograph them from there, kind of that idea of turning around and looking at everything bathed in this beautiful orange glowing light. Just know that they might be squinting, they might have some harsh shadows. So you may even try like side light or taking pictures of them in the shade with the sun, just kind of creating a softbox effect, or on a cloudy day, it also creates that nice soft mood instead of it being harsh shadows on their face. And place that horizon line. If you're using a portrait, don't place it right at their neck. Try and place it at their chest or at their waist so that they're not looking like their head's being chopped off by the horizon line. Okay, other than that, just try and find reflections where you can. Try and find foreground elements. Think about whether you want them to be in shadow and silhouette, or if you want every zone to be well exposed. In your sunset photos, I'd encourage you to try and take these pictures over a series of days so that you luck out. You have more chances of capturing a truly dramatic sunset, because not every day do you find a beautiful, awesome sunset. in our area. So yeah, happy shooting, have fun, good luck finding some truly awe-inspiring photographs. Bye.